Welcome back, and we're ready to pick off where I left off. And I left off with a magic word, textiles, because that's going to be the first significant factory type industry in the United States. As I indicated sort of hurriedly at the end of the hour last time, the United States was not unique in that respect. And we could talk a lot about other countries around the world, but just to mention briefly England. England was like the leading country in the Industrial Revolution back in the 17th century, hundreds of years before. And for England, as I mentioned, at one time back when we were still talking about early colonial American history, England had a first industry, and it was the textile industry. And that's just, as I said, that's just natural. I mean, it's logical that for many countries, England, the United States, Japan, India, Mexico, a lot of times the first industry developed is textiles because that's such a basic human need. Everybody needs clothing. There's always going to be a demand for textiles. So it's real easy then to start being the supply. You know, you can contribute supply. You're always going to have a demand because people always need clothing. England started this, and I can't remember if I talked about this because it would have been back in the 17th century. But England started with this way back then, and it was called the woolens industry. The terms woolen and textile could be used interchangeably because the raw material for the textile industry was wool. And this had all sorts of consequences for English agriculture, the increased raising of sheep, the conversion of a lot of sort of traditional farmland into sheep grazing land. All of that has to do with English history in the 17th century. And it was the woolens industry. Well, when we talked about that, I may have mentioned, I can't remember what happened because it's a couple months ago, but some people in class brought up the subject of cotton. And you talk about textiles, and cotton is an obvious thing to talk about. So people had raised that question and indicated at that time, I think, that, wait a minute, yes, eventually, but not yet. Not when we were talking about colonial America. Cotton was not a major crop during colonial America. And I think I explained that, you know, people knew about cotton as a desirable raw material for textiles, but it was just impractical to grow it because there were so many seeds in the fibers, and the only way to get them out was by sorting by hand, and that took forever. It was very labor intensive. It was just not economically practical. So although people knew about cotton, the only real raw material for textiles was woolens, and that was true in the United States. Even in the as colonies, we had manufacturing of textiles, but it was done at home. It was done on a very small scale, sometimes called homespun. A lot of housewives would get some wool, either from a neighbor or they had a sheep themselves, and then they would spin it and make it into clothing at home. And that was done, and that was the raw material, was wool. But I indicated to you then that the time would come when it would change. Well, here we are now in the aftermath of the War of 1812, starting around 1815, and the time has come. Because there's been an invention, a technological innovation around the 1790s, around 1794-95, when an American named Eli Whitney invented what would be known as the cotton gin. It's a shortening of cotton engine, cotton gin. And that made it practical to separate, by machine, to separate the seed and the fiber. So now we're going to start raising cotton. And we're going to start using cotton as a raw material. Now, the textile industry is going to get started in the United States in the years of the War of 1812 and the years before it. And at first it's still going to be a woolen industry. I mean, that's the raw material that people know, and that's what's used. And we started growing making our own textiles because for about a 10-year window there, from about 1805 to 1815, imports of textiles from Britain were very limited. We couldn't import a lot of the goods. We would make our own homespun. Yes, we could do that, but and that's just for home use, and that would be for people with low income and so forth. But to buy real clothing, woven together and so forth, it was still wool, and we imported it from England. Except that in that period of from 1805 to 1815, we could not import it from England. So the textile industry got started in the United States. Some manufacturers started to produce textiles with either wool or slowly transitioning to cotton as a raw material. Now, cotton can only be grown in the South. Cotton is a plant that requires a long growing season. You can't grow cotton in the North. You can't grow cotton even as far south as Virginia. Most of Virginia would still be too far north to raise cotton. You can only grow cotton when you kind of get even further south, down into maybe to North Carolina, certainly South Carolina, Georgia, and then moving out west into Mississippi and Alabama. You could raise cotton there. And logic suggests that the most efficient place to locate your factory then, if you're going to use cotton, isn't near where the cotton is grown. It's a lot easier to ship the cotton to a factory if it's close, and then you manufacture it into clothing, and you ship the clothing all over the country. But for some reason, the early textile mills were located in the North. They were located in New England. They were located in Massachusetts or on up into Vermont and New Hampshire, even as far north as Maine. And no cotton is grown there. So we could raise wool there, and we were still partly manufacturing textiles from wool. But as time goes on and we're going to start using more and more cotton, this means that the cotton has to be shipped all the way from the South up to the textile mills. And that doesn't make sense logically, because cotton is heavy, it's bulky, it's very expensive to ship it. It would be much easier to manufacture the product in the South and then to ship the manufactured goods. That's a much more economical way to do it. But it didn't happen that way. It's sort of contrary to logic that the early textile mills were located in the New England states, especially Massachusetts. Well, there is a reason. There's an explanation for that. And there are a couple factors that dictated that the early textile industry would be located in the North, far away from the actual cotton fields. So the cotton had to be shipped at great expense to the textile mills in the North. And there are a couple of reasons. One is New England had the capital to invest in the mills. Boston especially. Boston had long been one of our major trading centers. Boston was a center of commerce. In Boston, there were people who had been merchants, whose families had been merchants. There were several generations of merchants, wealthy merchants in Boston, with money to invest in textile factories and to build the mills. So there's money, there's cash for investment. Out of Boston, especially, there's an organization even called the Boston Associates, which is a sort of a consortium of wealthy investors led by a guy named Lowell, and he and other wealthy merchants in Boston got together, formed the Boston Associates, and then they went out and they built several textile mills. So the availability of capital was an issue. Now in the South, people have wealth, but their wealth is in the form mostly of land and slaves. They don't have a lot of capital down there. They don't have merchants, they don't have cities, they don't have banks, they don't have that kind of thing. The North did, Boston especially. So a lot of the mills were being built in Massachusetts or other New England states. Another reason is labor. Labor is always the obstacle to manufacturing in the United States. Labor is so much more expensive than in England. It's very hard to have textile mills or any kind of factory that can compete against the cheap labor from England. But the New England states had a source of cheap labor, which is not intuitively obvious. Sometimes I ask classes, what's the labor for the first textile mills that start getting developed in the United States in the early 19th century? And it's not obvious. What was happening to agriculture in New England was that land was running out. I mean, we started talking about the Puritans settling there in the 1620s, the 1630s, and there was lots of land. And there was plenty of land for everybody, and people could have farms far bigger than they could actually farm, with many acres left over for future generations, that the farmer could have a big family and all of his kids could get a land, and all of his grandkids could get land because there's plenty of land. But it's 200 years later. And in those 200 years, the population has increased a lot. But the amount of land, interestingly enough, has not increased at all. There's still just as much land as there was back in the 1620s when the Pilgrims first got off the Mayflower. So we're running out of land. Farms are getting smaller and smaller. It's getting harder and harder for farm families to get by. I mean, New England is what it's always been. It's a nation of small farmers, but it's getting harder and harder to be a successful small farmer, because as the population grows, land is getting tight. It's getting hard to have farms. So there's a lot of farmers in New England who are struggling, and they don't have a way to increase their land. They don't have a way to make money to make a living. But what they have is big families. And in that family are oftentimes teenage girls. Well, the answer to the question of what was the labor supply for the early textile industry in New England in 1810, 1815, the answer is teenage girls. Girls whose families were poor, had a hard time making ends meet because the farms had just gotten so small, it's hard to grow enough to make a living. So what they did was they put their daughters to work in the textile mills. And the textile mills would come around New England and recruit girls. They had people who would drive wagons around. Hey, you want a job? Come and get a job here at the textile mill. And a lot of farm families looking at a big family and some teenage girls, thinking, this is a way that we can get a little income. So that labor was available in New England. It wasn't available in other states, but it was available there. So you had the labor. So you've got the capital and you've got the labor. And another reason why the industry developed in New England was the practical sort of physics answer of how do you make the machinery turn. You're going to have some technology to run equipment, to run tools, to run factory machines. And a standard way to do it in those days was through water power, water mills. And in New England, up in the mountains, away from the cities, where there's a lot of rivers coming out of the mountains, those rivers have many places along them where there's some falls naturally occurring. There's a place where there's some high land and then it drops down. And on that site, where there's the falls are there naturally, you can build a mill, you can divert the water from the natural flow, from its natural river. You may have to build a little canal or something, but you can build a way to have the water come through and go through your mill, through your factory, and turn a water wheel and turn the equipment, and that's what provides the power that you need for your factory. And there are just a number of sites in New England, in Massachusetts, up in the hills, away from the cities. There's a number of sites where, with the technology available, with the civil engineering available at that time, which is pretty primitive by today's standards, but they could figure out how to build a little channel or something, divert the water from the river, go through some sort of a channel and drop down, and instead of just dropping down naturally, drop down through a factory, and in doing so turn the wheel. And that's what provided the power for the textile mills. They're called mills because they ran on a water mill. Now what this meant was that the manufacturers had to build entire towns for their workers. One of the most famous was named Lowell. It's a city in Massachusetts, it's still there to this day. Lowell, Massachusetts started with nothing more than a textile mill. There was no city there. It's up in the boonies, somewhere along the, I don't know what river it's on, Charles River or whatever, where there's a place where you could put the mill, and that was where Lowell, the guy who was in the Boston Associates, where he built his textile mill. He had to build an entire city for the workers, and that's expensive. It's a tough deal because you've got to provide them with housing, you've got to provide them with places to shop, a church for the girls to go to school, to still stay in church, and you had to ensure that they would be safe, that these teenage girls would be safe against the great forces of evil out there, teenage boys trying to get the girls, and so you have to assure the parents that their daughters will be safe if they come down into Lowell to go to work in the textile mill, and then they'll probably only stay there for a couple of years, so you're constantly recruiting again. It's a tough operation. It's expensive, but it works. You can do it. You can get the cotton cheaply enough. You can get the girls to work cheaply enough that it's more expensive than labor in England. Even the teenage girls could command a higher salary than all of the homeless people in England who were desperate for work. So the textile industry got started, and it's a struggle, but it's working and it's making money. But it all depends on the fact that we don't have to compete against English manufacturers because we're at war with England. These things get started around 1810, 1812, when we're not trading with England, either because of the trade regulations or the embargo or whatever, or we're in war. So the industry does not have to compete, and it survives. And then, of course, in 1815, the war ended. And for some years, the English textile manufacturers had been storing things in warehouses because the English textile industry was devastated by the war because one of their main markets was the United States. So they've got all of these textiles that are piled up there, and as soon as the war ended, then English manufacturers started dumping their products on the American market. They could bring things over, sell it at real low prices, and take the market and wipe the American textile industry out of existence. And that's what they're facing. So what are they going to do? We have to pause here for a second, and I'll answer the question in a minute.